Here's a question that broke the legal system of an entire U.S. territory. If a marriage is illegal, if it was never recognized by the laws of the United States, does it still count? Does it count when a man takes a woman into his home and introduces her as his wife to every person that he knows? Does it count when she raises his children, manages his household, and spends years of her life bound to his name? Does it count when she finally decides to leave? That last one? The answer in 1875 in the territory of Utah was, it depends on who's asking. If a federal judge was asking, the kind of judge who wanted to punish Brigham Young, then yes, the marriage was real. Real enough to order $500 a month in alimony. Real enough to throw the most powerful man in Utah territory into federal custody when he refused to pay. But if you ask the same federal court 2 years later, a different judge, a different political climate, the same woman, the same facts, the answer was different. The divorce was denied. The marriage, turns out, never legally existed, so the woman had no standing. Her name was Ann Eliza Young. She called herself wife 19, but by most scholarly accounts, she was actually wife number 52. She grew up in a polygamist family, married into polygamy, escaped polygamy, and spent the better part of a decade trying to convince a country to do something about it, and she almost succeeded. Ann lectured in every major city in America. She filled concert halls and opera houses, sat for interviews in grand hotels. She testified before Congress. She published a memoir that sold by the hundreds of thousands. Senators read it on the floor of the United States Senate. The legislation that finally gave the federal government real tools to prosecute polygamy, the Edmunds Act of 1882, was passed in no small part because of the noise Ann Young made. And then she disappeared. Not suddenly, but more gradually. The way people disappear when the cause they gave their lives to moves on without them. When the speeches stop drawing crowds, when the books stop selling, newspapers find a new sensation. By the time Brigham Young's plural marriage system was formally dismantled by the LDS Church in 1890, Ann Eliza Young was already gone from the public light. No one made a speech about her contribution. No one named a building after her. The women who came after her, the ones who could vote, the ones who had legal protection, most of them never even heard of her. I'm John Genoa, and you're watching America's Strangest History. This video is about the self-proclaimed 19th wife of Brigham Young, and more specifically, what she actually did. The actual woman in the actual courtroom in the actual newspapers of the time. We have the articles and the interviews. Let's hear her speaking in her own words about what happened to her and what she decided to do about it. This is the story about the limits of law, about the way a person can trap you and protect you at the same time, depending on which direction the political wind is blowing. Sadly, this is also about what it costs a woman to become famous for her suffering. And interestingly, about what happens when that famous part ends. What happened to Ann Young? Let's start at the beginning. Ann Eliza Young was born in 1844 in Nauvoo, Illinois, which, if you know your Mormon history, tells you almost everything about the world she came into. Nauvoo was the city that the Latter-day Saints built on the banks of the Mississippi after they were driven out of Missouri at gunpoint. About 1844, it was one of the largest cities in Illinois. It had a temple under construction, its own militia. It had Brigham Young, Joseph Smith, and it had a secret. That year, the year Ann Eliza Young was born, the secret was starting to leak. The doctrine of plural marriage, what the outside world called polygamy, what the saints called celestial marriage, or the principle. Now, Joseph Smith had been practicing it for years. A small circle of men knew, their wives knew or were beginning to know. The revelation hadn't been made public yet. That wouldn't happen for another 8 years. But in Nauvoo in 1844, the architecture of the life that Anne would eventually be trapped inside was already being built. Her father was Chauncey Webb. He was a convert to the church, a craftsman, a true believer. He took plural wives. Her mother, Eliza Churchill Webb, was the first wife, and she stayed. That's a significant detail because Anne didn't just grow up around polygamy, she grew up watching her mother endure it. She'd later write about it at length. She described her mother's suffering as constant. It's a slow erosion. The exhaustion of a woman who shares her husband with other women under the same roof, who's told this is God's will and that her resistance is a failure of faith. She writes that she watched her mother age beyond her years. She writes that she swore to herself she'd never live that way. Now here's what makes Ann Young's story genuinely strange and genuinely American. She knew exactly what polygamy looked like from the inside. She watched it destroy her mother's peace of mind since she was old enough to understand what was happening. She understood the theology, the economics, the social pressure, the way the community closed around a family and made leaving almost impossible. And she still ended up as a plural wife. Now, not once, twice. Her first marriage was to a man named James L.D. She was 19 years old. The marriage was, by all accounts, a disaster. D wasn't kind. The details are sparse in the historical record, but Ann's own account describes abuse and abandonment. She had 2 children with D before she left him. Now she was a divorced woman in Utah Territory in the 1860s with 2 children, in a community where a woman's standing was almost entirely dependent on her relationship with a man, where the church was the government, and the government was Brigham Young. And Brigham Young had opinions about women who left their husbands. And those opinions weren't great. The pressure to remarry wasn't subtle. The man doing the pressing, turned out, was Brigham Young himself. She later described his courtship as persistent. She describes her own resistance, being told by people she trusted that to marry Brigham Young, the prophet, was an honor, that her children would be provided for. She'd want for nothing. All her previous suffering prepared her for this higher calling. She was 23 years old. She said yes. On April 6, 1868, Ann Webb became sealed to Brigham Young in a celestial marriage ceremony. She was, by her own count, wife number 19. By the scholarly count of the Utah State Archives, she was closer to wife number 52. The number discrepancies matter less than what comes next, because within a year, according to her own testimony and according to the legal complaint she'd eventually file in court, Brigham Young stopped coming around. He had 63 other people dependent on him. He had a territory to run, political enemies multiplying in Washington, and he had younger wives who held his attention more reliably. Ann Eliza Young, with 2 kids from her first marriage, living in a house she didn't own, dependent on an allowance that came when it came, discovered that being the plural wife of the most powerful man in Utah wasn't protection. It was a different kind of trap, more gilded than the one she'd grown up in, but a trap nonetheless. The question is, what's she gonna do about it? On August 2nd, 1873, the Salt Lake Weekly Tribune ran a story on page 1. The headline said, "The Divorce Suit, Ann Eliza Young versus Brigham Young." Now, we have that paper. I pulled it from the archive. And what's striking about it isn't the headline, it's the language of the legal complaint itself, which the Tribune printed in full. Brigham Young's lawyer anticipated this moment, and their response was a masterpiece of legal maneuvering. Here's what Ann claimed in her filing: that she and Brigham Young were married on April 6, 1868, that for approximately 1 year after the marriage, he lived with her and treated her as her wife, that after that year, he subjected her to, and I'm reading from the filing now, a specific course of cruel and inhuman treatment ending in absolute desertion. She had no means of support. She was asking for $1,000 a month for herself and her children and $20,000 to cover legal expenses. $20,000 in 1873. That's a lot of money. Now, Brigham Young's response was filed with the court within days, and it said something. He denied he and Ann had ever legally intermarried. Ever. He acknowledged that the ceremony took place. He acknowledged that it was a plural or celestial marriage performed according to the doctrine of his church. But he argued that the ceremony has no legal standing in civil law. His only legal wife, the one recognized by the United States government, was Mary Ann Angel. They married in 1834. He claimed Ann wasn't his wife. She was, by the laws of the United States, nothing. And he went further. He argued that on April 10th, 1863, 5 years before the ceremony with him, Ann married a man named James L.D. As far as he knew, she never legally divorced D. She was therefore still D's lawful wife. He claimed that if the court granted her divorce from Brigham Young, it would simply be confirming that Ann committed bigamy. Did you catch that last part? If the marriage to him was real enough to divorce, she was guilty of bigamy for entering it. If the marriage to him was not real, she had no case. Either way, she lost. The Albany Law Journal called the alimony award that followed one of those judicial outrages sometimes perpetrated in the name of reform. Now, even papers that had no sympathy for Brigham Young couldn't agree on whether Ann had any legal standing at all. But Judge James McKean decided she did. McKean was a federal judge, a Gentile, meaning non-Mormon, was appointed by President Grant specifically to bring federal authority to bear on the Utah Territory. Now, he and Brigham Young had been circling each other for years. When Ann's complaint landed landed on his docket, McKean saw something useful. He ruled that the case could proceed. He ordered Brigham Young to pay $500 a month in temporary support while the divorce case worked its way through the courts. Not $1,000 like she asked for. She got $500 and $3,000 in legal fees. But Brigham Young refused to pay. So 30 days were given to him to comply, and they expired. Then another 30 days. Nothing. His lawyers filed motions, the case was appealed, delayed, argued, it was re-argued. Meanwhile, Ann was still waiting, her lawyers were waiting, and the media was watching every move. One paper reported that the alimony case continues to excite intense interest in Salt Lake, and the people anxiously wait to see what Brigham is going to do. It noted that several other wives, encouraged by Ann's partial success, were threatening rebellion. It speculated that the prophet was destined to enjoy anything but a peaceful old age in the bosom of his extensive family. That line is from a real newspaper from 1875. She cracked something wide open. Then in October 1875, Judge Borman, McKean's successor, ordered Brigham Young to appear in court to show cause why he should not be punished for contempt. Now, he owed $9,500 in back alimony. He hadn't paid $1 of it. He appeared through his attorney, and the court found him in contempt. Brigham Young, president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, prophet, territorial governor in all but title, the most powerful man west of the Missouri River, was sentenced to 1 day in prison and fined $25. 1 day, $25. He was taken into federal custody and held overnight. The case then went all the way to the president's cabinet in Washington. Now, Brigham's lawyers argued that the local Utah courts were stacked against him by political enemies. They argued Ann voluntarily became his concubine under Mormon law and therefore had no standing in federal court. The case was referred to the Attorney General of the United States, and then the political wind shifted. McKean was removed from the bench. His alimony order was overturned by his successor, Judge Lowe. Judge Borman tried to revive it. The higher courts said no. April 27, 1877, the court issued its final ruling. We have the docket entry. 4 words. Decree of divorce denied. Ann fought for almost 4 years. She put the most powerful man in Utah in federal custody. She generated more newspaper coverage than almost any other legal case in the territory's history. Now, Ann exposed the legal impossibility at the heart of polygamy, the way it was real enough to control a woman's life, but not real enough to protect her. And she lost. The question now was, what was she going to do with that loss? She already started answering it because while the courts were grinding through her case, Ann already took her story somewhere else entirely. She took it on the road. While her lawyers were arguing in Salt Lake City, Ann Young was in New York. She was standing on a stage telling her story to a paying audience. This is the part of her life that most people, if they know anything at all about her, think that they understand. The wronged wife, the lecture circuit, the crowds, the applause. What they don't understand is the machinery behind it, or what it actually cost her to become the woman on that stage. So let's back up slightly. The American lecture circuit in the 1870s was a serious industry. It was like the television of its era, the internet of its era. If you wanted to reach a mass audience, I mean really reach them in their city, in the halls that they chose to attend, having paid money to be there, you went on the circuit. Mark Twain did it. Frederick Douglass did it. Susan B. Anthony did it. The circuit had booking agents, tour managers, advance men who rode into a city ahead of the speaker to plaster billboards on the walls and plant stories in the newspapers. It wasn't an amateur operation. Ann Young entered this world in 1873 while her divorce case was still pending. Her booking agent and tour manager was a man named Major James B. Pond. Now, if that name sounds familiar, it's because Pond managed some of the most famous speakers in America. He knew exactly what he had in Ann, and he knew how to sell it. The lecture was called Life in Mormon Bondage, and the country couldn't get enough of it. She played concert halls, opera houses, church auditoriums. Ann spoke in Boston, Chicago, New York, Washington. She even spoke in small cities that never hosted a nationally known speaker before. Newspapers in every city ran advance coverage before she arrived and review coverage after she left. We have a description of her from that period. It comes from a newspaper account, reprinted, interestingly, by a Salt Lake paper that was trying to discredit her, which means that even her enemies had to acknowledge what she looked like on stage. She was described as a woman of superb loveliness, a little perhaps above the medium height, a well-developed form, dark eyes and hair, a proud, majestic walk, in every respect presenting the appearance of a woman that would easily captivate the heart of a Gentile and more easily the heart of the great Mormon. That last line, that's the tell. The writer's already doing two things at once here. He's admiring her and undermining her. Captivating isn't quite the same as credible. The physical description's meant to make you wonder whether her power comes from what she looks like or what she knows. But put a pin in that for now because it becomes important later. First, what was she actually saying on that stage? Well, we have an interview from the New York Press. She gave it at the Grand Central Hotel. She's sitting in her room, recovering from what she describes as a severe illness. A reporter shown in. She stands to greet him. She says, and I'm reading from the account now, "I'm very glad you called upon me. I don't hesitate to say that I want to say something for myself. My history, my actions, motives, and present errand seem to be thoroughly misunderstood by the public." Then she says something that stops you cold. "I'm certain that Mormon money is the cause of this misrepresentation." She knew she was being managed in the press. She knew that money was being spent to undercut her. She literally said it out loud to a reporter in a hotel room in New York City. Ann talked about Brigham Young, about what it was like to first learn he wanted her for his wife. She said, and again I'm working from the interview, that Brigham Young was next to God in her mind. She said that when she first heard that he wanted her, she couldn't have been more shocked or horrified. Her own father presented the idea to her. She resisted, but believed. She described his household with a kind of precise devastation that only comes from having actually lived inside it. She talked about loneliness, the neglect, the particular humiliation of being one of dozens, of receiving an allowance that sometimes came and sometimes didn't, watching her children grow up in a house where their father appeared occasionally like a dignitary passing through. Now the audience wept, then they gave their standing ovations. Then a story appeared. It was published in the Chicago Tribune and reprinted widely. It claimed that Ann and Major Pond, her tour manager, shared a sleeping car on a train journey, that their behavior behind the curtain of that sleeping car had been observed. Witnesses were prepared to testify. The story included a supposed quote from Ann herself, whispering to Pond in the dark, "Major, you must be more cautious. You're getting too imprudent, and if you continue to do so, we'll soon be exposed and our bright but short career will be gone forever." Now, it's almost certainly fiction. The Salt Lake City paper that reprinted it said as much. They called it, in their own words, the wicked invention of some unscrupulous Mormon. But that's how the game was played. You can't beat her argument in court, you can't silence her on the stage, so you go after her character. You make the story about her body instead of her words. You turn the wronged woman into a scheming seductress, make audiences wonder, plant the seed of doubt. It's a very old playbook, and it didn't entirely work because Ann Young kept speaking. City after city, year after year, the tour ran for years. The crowds kept coming. In Salt Lake City, her own city, his city, she lectured to a full house. She wrote that Brigham Young's own daughters filled 2 rows of seats, that Mormon women sent her letters of encouragement in secret. Leading men of the church tried and failed to stop people from attending. She wrote, "So a lot of his daughters came." Think about what it took to stand on that stage in that city. She left everything she knew, her community, her faith, her protection, such as it was under the most powerful name in the Utah Territory. She filed a lawsuit that she'd ultimately lose. She'd been called a liar, a schemer, a concubine, an extortionist, a fallen woman, and she kept talking. The book came next. In 1876, Ann Young published a book. She called it Wife Number 19, or The Story of a Life in Bondage. The full subtitle was longer than that. It read, "Being a complete expose of Mormonism and revealing the sorrows, sacrifices, and sufferings of women in polygamy." That's a mouthful. So clearly she wasn't hiding what the book was for. It was published by a Hartford, Connecticut firm. It ran over 600 pages, sold hundreds of thousands of copies. It's one of the best-selling books in America in the year of the nation's centennial. The same year the Americans were celebrating 100 years of liberty and self-governance, this woman was selling a detailed account of what life looked like for a woman inside a theocratic system that the United States government spent 20 years failing to dismantle. The timing wasn't accidental. But before we talk about what the book says, I want to be honest with you about what the book is, because Ann is a serious person making a serious argument, and she deserves a serious accounting. Wife Number 19 is a memoir. but it's also a polemic. She knew her audience. She knew what they wanted. Drama, suffering, revelation, moral clarity. She gave it to them. There are passages that read like abolitionist literature, passages that read like Victorian sensation novels, and describe moments of what feels like genuine documentary precision and moments where the argument gets ahead of the evidence. She isn't a neutral witness of her own life. No one is. But here's the thing about wife number 19 that gets overlooked when people dismiss it as ruffled feathers. The legal and institutional claims she makes are largely verifiable, and they check out. She describes the economic structure of plural marriage with the kind of detail that only comes from having lived inside it. The way household finances worked or didn't, the hierarchy amongst wives, the way older wives were displaced by younger ones, the way children from plural marriages existed in a legal gray zone. Their inheritance rights were unclear, their status dependent entirely on the goodwill of a man who had 50 or 60 dependents competing for his attention. Anne describes the pressure placed on women to accept the principle, the theological coercion, the way refusing a sealing to a worthy priest holder was framed as a threat to your eternal salvation. She writes about her mother at length and with a grief that doesn't feel performative. She writes that her mother's life was one of silent endurance. She watched her mother become someone she didn't recognize. The woman who raised her with warmth and strength was slowly replaced by someone diminished, quieted, resigned. But she was also writing about herself. The book landed like a rock. Reviews ran in newspapers across the country. Ministers read passages from it on Sunday sermons. Women's temperance groups used it as evidence in their arguments for federal intervention. Anti-polygamy societies formed specifically around the arguments that she made. That polygamy wasn't just a moral outrage, but a structural one. It was a system designed to keep women legally helpless, economically dependent, and socially isolated. Congress paid attention. This isn't a metaphor. Senators and representatives bought the book. They quoted it on floor debates. They cited it in committee hearings. The Poland Act of 1874 had already passed, tightening federal court jurisdiction over Utah, but it didn't go far enough. The pressure Anne generated through her tour and her book helped build the political will for something stronger, the Edmunds Act of 1882. Now, the Edmunds Act made polygamy a felony. It stripped polygamists of their right to vote, to serve on juries, and to hold public office. It established a federal commission to oversee elections in the Utah territory. And over the next 8 years, more than 1,000 men were prosecuted under it. The LDS Church formally abandoned the practice of plural marriage in 1890. That's a straight line. It runs from Ann Young's complaint, filed in the 3rd District of Utah in 1873, through her lecture tour, her book, through the congressional debate, to the Edmunds Act, to a manifesto. It's not the only line. There were other reformers, other pressures, other voices. History rarely has a single cause, but Ann Young is a link in a chain that's been consistently undervalued. It's possibly because her divorce case failed, or because her book was something sensational. Here's what I know. She said polygamy was a system of bondage. She said it in courtrooms, on stages, in 500 pages of published testimony. She said it when the most powerful theocratic institution in the American West was working actively to discredit her. And then the system she was describing was dismantled. Now that's not nothing. That's the opposite of nothing. But there's a cost to becoming the symbol of a cause. A cost that her book, with all its controlled fury and careful argument, doesn't quite prepare you for. Because when that cause moves on, when the legislation passes, when the church issues its manifesto, when the newspapers find a new sensation, the symbol doesn't move on with it. The symbol just becomes a person again, and that person still has to live somewhere. Anne was 46 years old when the LDS Church abandoned plural marriage in 1890. Now, what happened to her after that is a harder story to tell because the record goes quiet in a way that tells you something about how history works, about who gets remembered and why, and about the particular silence that follows a woman who was too loud for too long. Here's what the historical record gives us after 1877. Brigham Young died on August 29th of that year. That's 4 months after the court denied Anne's divorce. He died at home, surrounded by wives and children, having never paid her $1 of the alimony that he owed. His estate was valued at somewhere between $600,000 and $1.6 million, depending on which accounting you believed. The legal fight over it began amongst his surviving wives and creditors. It would drag on for years, and Anne wasn't among those wives. The court saw to that. She kept lecturing. The tour continued into the late 1870s. The book kept selling. Her name still appeared in newspapers. But something shifted. The legal loss had had done what her enemy's smear campaign really couldn't accomplish. It introduced doubt, not about her character necessarily, but about her standing, whether she was a wronged wife or simply, as one hostile paper put it, a concubine attempting extortion. Then she did something that surprised a lot of people. She got married again. His name was Moses Denning. He's a wealthy one-armed logger from Mainstay, Michigan. He wasn't a Mormon. She married him in 1875 while the tour was still at its peak, and she stopped giving lectures the week she married him. She stopped entirely. The timing tells you something. She believed she was done, that she had a life again. She was wrong. In 1892, Denning abandoned her. She filed for divorce the following year on the grounds of adultery and cruelty. The court granted it. She received a settlement of $5,000 in alimony. One time, 1893. Now, with no lecture income coming in and the public that largely moved on, we got 3 marriages, 3 divorces. The LDS Church abandoned polygamy in 1890. The cause she fought for was won, and now she was alone. The scholars who first tried to reconstruct Ann Young's later life hit a wall. The most thorough academic accounting of Brigham Young's wives, published in Dialogue, a journal of Mormon thought, listed her death date as simply not known. Think about that. This is a woman who was front page news in every major American city for nearly a decade, who testified before Congress, who published one of the best-selling books of 1876, whose divorce case went to the president's cabinet, whose name appeared in the Salt Lake City Tribune, the New York Herald, the Chicago Tribune, the Boston Globe, and hundreds of papers from Utah to the Atlantic coast. And scholars couldn't find when she died, but census records could, and eventually they did. Here's what the final chapter actually looked like. After the Denning divorce, she drifted. The 1900 census found her in Breckenridge, Colorado. No explanation why, no record of what she was doing there. In 1907, a newspaper ran an article on the 30th anniversary of Brigham Young's death. It updated readers on his then surviving widows. Ann Eliza Young got 1 paragraph. She was living in Lansing, Michigan, divorced a 3rd time. A footnote in a story about him. The following year, 1908, she published a revised version of Wife Number 19. She called it Life in Mormon Bondage. She rewrote her own story, scrubbed 2 of the 3 marriages from the record, all mention of James D. gone, all mentions of Moses Denning gone. A woman who built her entire public identity on unflinching personal testimony chose, at age 64, to erase parts of herself. We don't know exactly why. Shame, maybe? Legal caution, possibly? A desire to control what little remained of her narrative? Possibly all 3. There's one more detail that belongs here. Before the revised book came out, she returned to Utah to claim $2,000 legacy left to her by James D., the man she called for the rest of her days, the one who blighted her life. He left her money when he died. She took it. By 1910, she moved to Sparks, Nevada. It's a small railroad town just east of Reno. She became estranged from her sons. Neither maintained contact with her after they reached adulthood. One of the grandsons, interviewed years later, said, "I hope to hell I never see her again." We don't know what she did in Sparks for those final years. There's no lecture on record, no newspaper interviews, no public appearances. On December 7th, 1917, Ann Eliza Young died in her home in Sparks, Nevada. She was 73 years old. The cause of death was pneumonia. She was buried 2 days later at Mountain View Cemetery in Reno, section C2, plot 88.5, grave 2. The burial records list her name as Anna Denning, not Ann Eliza Young, not wife number 19, Anna Denning, the name of the husband who abandoned her. There's no headstone. The plot number is documented. The grave is unmarked. The LDS Church had formally abandoned polygamy 27 years before she died. The cause she gave her life to had won, and nobody put a name on a stone. Now, we set out at the beginning of this video to ask a question, not just about Ann Young specifically, but about what her story reveals. Here's what I think it reveals. A woman in 1873 looked at a system that controlled her since birth. It shaped her mother's suffering, structured her first marriage, drove her into a second marriage with a man who had 50-something or other wives, and she decided to use every tool available to help fight it. The tools were limited, brutally limited. She couldn't vote or hold office. She couldn't practice law or run for Congress or appoint a judge who might draft legislation. She could file a lawsuit. She could speak and write, and she did all 3. We know she filed the lawsuit. The speaking changed minds and the writing changed laws, and then the country moved on without her. The newspapers that covered her, the hostile ones, calling her a female shark and a concubine and an extortionist, they were making a bet. They were betting that if they made the story about her body and her motives and her personal failings, the larger argument would die with her reputation. And they were wrong. The argument outlived the attacks. The change she pushed for came slowly, painfully, incompletely, but it came. Her name was Ann Eliza Young, former wife of Brigham Young. She called herself wife number 19. She was, by most scholarly accounts, wife number 52. The number never mattered as much as the fact that she made you learn it. She's buried in an unmarked grave in Reno, Nevada, under a name that wasn't really hers, but we know where she is. And now, so do you. I'm John Genoa, and this has been America's Strangest History. Thanks for watching.